Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. We are continuing our study of the Olivet Discourse. Is it divided or is it united? Is it one subject, i.e., the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, the Lord's coming, the end of the Old Covenant age at that time? Or is it two subjects, the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70 and the so-called imaginary, in my estimation, end of time, the end of the endless Christian age? Which is it? Well, we have been focusing on Matthew 25, 1 to 13, and Jesus' parable of the coming of the bridegroom and the story of the 5 wise and the 5 foolish virgins. Do you know that I have encountered people that when they were confronted with the evidence that this is really all about the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel and the promise of the Lord's coming to remarry Israel, that they have said, well, you see, Preston, and by the way, these are people who traditionally have understood Matthew 25 to be all about the coming of the Lord, to marry the church, strangely enough, at the end of the church age. Well, how could the Lord be coming at the end of the new covenant, which is the marriage covenant, coming at the end of the new covenant marriage age to marry her? So he's going to put an end to the new covenant, which is the new covenant wedding contract, going to put an end to that, but he comes to marry the church. Do you see how contradictory the futurist view is? Okay, so I have had them say, look, Preston, you don't understand. The parable of Matthew chapter 25 is not about the coming of the Lord. It's not about the wedding at all. It's about being ready. And my response has been, ready for what? Watching for what? Well, that's about the time you get the proverbial, I just put my foot in my mouth look, that proverbial deer in the headlight look that says, I don't have an answer for the problem that I just created for myself. Look, folks, if Matthew 25 is not about the coming of the Lord for the parable, for the wedding, then what are the 5 wise and the 5 foolish virgins supposed to be waiting for? What are they supposed to be prepared for? The desperation of people trying to get away from the very obvious and the very undeniable realities of what the Bible says are literally astounding. And yet that's what we encounter. Okay, now then, Isaiah chapter 62. Now, every time I read this chapter, I am reminded of how utterly ignorant I was in my early ministry. And that's not to say that I'm, incredibly smart now. It's just that I have learned a lot of things. You see, ladies and gentlemen, I was raised in an environment that said God nailed the law to the cross, the old law. And the beginning on Pentecost, God was dealing with the new covenant, with the church. He was no longer dealing with, no longer concerned with Old Covenant Israel or fulfilling God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. That was my background. Years ago, I was sitting in my office. I was the minister in Shawnee, Oklahoma at the time. And I was reading Acts 24, 14 and following, where Paul, actually verse 13 and following, where Paul on trial said, this I confess to you, that after the way that they call a sect, do I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things, now watch this, believing all things that are written in the law and the prophets, that there is literally about to be the resurrection of the dead, the just and the unjust. And, you know, you've heard about that old saying, a brick wall fell on me. You've heard about the saying, a semi ran over me. You have heard that old saying, being hit up beside the head by a 2x4. Well, this wasn't a 2x4. This was an 8x10. Because I sat there and I thought, now this is very, very early in my eschatological struggles. I had already started seeing all the multitudinous time statements. And I didn't have an explanation for them that would work. I tried, but it didn't work. So that train ran over me because here was my thinking. If God was through with Israel at the cross, if God nailed the Old Testament, and by the way, for all of those Church of Christ folks whom I dearly love, all of those Church of Christ folks that watch my videos, let me point out to you something very quickly. I have quote after quote after quote after quote in my files from leading prominent Church of Christ ministers down through the years, all of whom say, when the New Testament speaks of, quote, the law, it is inclusive of the entirety of the Old Testament. All of it. Not some of it, not most of it, not a bit of it, all of it. So if all of a sudden someone wants to jump up and say, well, Jesus said, not one jot or one tittle shall pass from the law until it's all fulfilled. What Jesus had in mind there was that he was going to fulfill the ceremonial law. And that's all that had to be fulfilled for the law to pass. Or when Jesus fulfilled the moral law, all of the old covenant, except the moral law, would pass away. Those were the arguments I made. But they don't work. So I was sitting in my office, still holding to the view that God was through with Israel at the cross. That Jesus nailed the law of Moses, the law and the prophets. And notice what Paul said in Acts 24:14. Believing all things that are written in the law and the prophets. Paul is being very sure that he is all-inclusive, that he is totally comprehensive in his expectation of the fulfillment of the resurrection. So Paul was saying, unequivocally, undeniably, his eschatological hope was taken from and based on, it was the anticipation of the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. And again, that train just came roaring through and said, wait a minute, Preston. If God was through with Old Covenant Israel at the cross, if he nailed the law and the prophets to the cross, how in the world could Paul still be expecting, looking for, anticipating the fulfillment of the law and the prophets at the resurrection, which I placed at the time at this imaginary end of time? How could that be? I was just blown away. And in 1991, I believe it was, memory kind of fades a little, I had a formal public debate with Bill Lockwood in Marlow, Oklahoma. In a written question to Brother Lockwood, I asked, are your eschatological hopes, the hope of the second coming, the judgment, and the resurrection, based upon the yet future fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel? And that was a written question. Well, he was supposed to hand it back immediately after answering. He didn't answer, or didn't give them back. time for the debate to start came, and I had to walk to the table, and I said, do you have the answers to my questions? And it was like, yeah, here they are. In response to that question, out beside it, in great big bold letters, capital letters, underlined 3 times, in quotation marks, with 3 exclamation points, he said, no. So when I got up, I pointed out Acts 24:14. And I looked him in the eye and I said, Brother Lockwood, you have just admitted that you are preaching a different gospel. If it is true that Paul's eschatological hope was nothing but that which was found in Moses, the law, and the prophets, and if you say you do not preach an eschatology taken from the law and the prophets, you just admitted that you preach a different gospel from Paul. He never said a word in response. Had a third debate with him in Houston the next year. I kept pressing that point and pressing it until finally, when he had the final speech of the debate, he got up and said, now, about this issue of Paul's eschatology being the fulfillment of the law, and he said, you know, it may be that in the churches of Christ, we've not dealt with that subject properly, but that doesn't mean Preston is true. He is a heretic. It's not the exact word he used, but folks, I said all that, and all of this is basically introduction to Isaiah 62. When I discovered what Paul said, I began to make it my goal to understand the Old Testament well enough so that I knew the Old Testament well enough, and I still work on this every single day. I wanted to know the Old Testament well enough so that when I read the teaching of Jesus, I didn't even have to have my center column references. I would hear the echo of those Old Testament prophecies that he was drawing from. Now, mind you, I consider a good center column reference or a bottom reference of Bible to be invaluable, and I use them. Hope you do too. But I discovered that Isaiah 62 is one of the most powerful and one of the most wonderful Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel about the consummation of eschatology to be found. So beginning tomorrow, we're going to be looking at Isaiah 62 and what it predicted and prophesied, and how Jesus quoted from that text, as well as, by the way, Isaiah 40, and how Revelation 22 and Jesus in Revelation 22 quoted verbatim from Isaiah 62 to speak of the things that were to shortly come to pass. This is an incredible study. So I'll see you on the flip side.